Okay, let's dive in. We all know Halloween. It's pumpkins, candy, costumes. It feels so familiar, almost comforting in its spookiness.
Right, it's just part of the calendar now.
But if you actually stop and think about it, really think about why we do these things, it gets a little strange, doesn't it? Why is it all about ghosts and skeletons? Why are we carving scary faces into vegetables? Of all things. And this whole idea of one night where the veil is thin, where does that actually come from?
That familiarity is exactly the point, I think. It masks something much deeper. We sort of assume it's all just vague folklore, bits and pieces cobbled together.
But it's not.
No. The real origins, especially the Halloween we know today, the Americanized version, they're incredibly dark. And they're tied to a specific, horrifyingly real event.
And that's the core of our deep dive today, isn't it? Tracing how modern Halloween wasn't born from some Gothic novel, but forged in the trauma of An Garda Mór, the Great Hunger, in 19th century Ireland.
Exactly. It's a story about how a society was pushed to the absolute edge, about a biological disaster hitting a system designed to fail, and, well, about policies that turned crisis into utter catastrophe.
So we'll be looking at the economic setup in Ireland that made it so vulnerable, the specifics of the potato blight itself.
Yeah, and crucially, the man-made decisions, the political and economic choices that amplified the suffering immensely.
And then how the survivors carried that trauma, those memories, those traditions across the ocean, and how over time they morphed into the holiday you see celebrated globally.
That's quite a journey.
It really is. So to start, we need to go back. We need to understand what life was like on that knife edge in Ireland just before the famine hit. Right, so understanding the famine's impact means understanding the everyday reality before it struck. Let's try and pick a picture. Say, County Tipperary, maybe 1844. A typical family. Let's call them the Murphys, Roger and Mary, maybe 5 kids.
And the first thing you have to do is ditch any romantic ideas about quaint Irish cottages. That wasn't the reality for the vast majority.
No. What was it then?
We have British government surveys from the time they weren't done out of concern, mind you, mostly for tax purposes, but they categorized housing. And nearly half of all rural families lived in what they called fourth-class dwellings.
Fourth class? What does that even mean?
It means a single-room mud hut, often windowless. That's it.
Just one room for a whole family?
One room, the walls, packed earth, stones, maybe some straw mixed in, the floor, just dirt, damp earth. Forget furniture, maybe a rough wooden bench if you were lucky.
And how many people crammed in there?
Could be a dozen, easily.
Yeah.
Sleeping side by side on piles of straw on the floor, straw you'd have to change constantly because of the dampness seeping up from the ground. And, key detail, no chimney.
No chimney. So where did the smoke go?
There'd be a peat fire smoldering in the middle of the floor. Peat dug from the local bog. The smoke, well, it just filled the room. Stinging your eyes, coating your lungs. It might slowly filter out through the thatched roof if the thatch wasn't too tightly packed, or escape through the single doorway.
So they lived in constant smoke.
Constant smoke, constant damp. It was an existence stripped bare, really. Utterly miserable conditions by our standards.
And they weren't the only inhabitants, were they? You mentioned livestock earlier.
Exactly. Economic necessity meant the animals shared the space. Chickens pecking around your feet, definitely. But the most important one, the family pig.
Ah, the pig.
Usually had its own little corner. And that pig wasn't just food. In fact, they rarely ate it themselves. It was their savings account, their insurance policy, their only source of cash.
How so?
Selling that pig, usually once a year, was the only way Roger and Mary could get the hard currency they needed to pay the rent. Everything else was subsistence. They might eat potatoes, maybe some buttermilk, a bit of fish if they were near the coast, but that pig, that was the rent money. Lose the pig, you lose the land.
Living right on the edge. Absolute subsistence.
Utterly dependent on that single transaction and on the potato crop feeding them the rest of the year.
Which brings us to the crucial question. Why? Why this precarious existence? It wasn't because they were bad farmers, right? This was systemic.
Absolutely systemic. It was a cage built over centuries by deliberate policy. You have to go back to the penal laws.
Explain those.
These were laws imposed by the British Protestant ruling class starting way back, designed specifically to break the power of Irish Catholics. They couldn't own land above a certain value, couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't practice law, couldn't even own a horse worth more than £5. Gaelic language was suppressed, education restricted. The goal was total disenfranchisement.
And the impact on land ownership was devastating.
Completely. By the early 1700s, Catholics who were, 90% of the population, legally owned less than 10% of the land, maybe even less. Some sources say as low as 5%.
So who owned everything?
A tiny minority. Anglo-Irish Protestant gentry, many of whom were absentee landlords.
Meaning that they didn't even live there.
Often not. They lived comfortably in London, maybe Bath on their English estates. Ireland was just a source of income. They probably never met the people living on their land, just names on a ledger.
How did they manage it then, from afar?
Through middlemen, agents whose job was purely to extract the maximum possible rent. And these middlemen would often subdivide the land again and again into smaller and smaller plots to squeeze more tenants in, and they'd hike the rent relentlessly every year. This was called rack renting.
Rack renting sounds brutal.
It was. It meant someone like Roger Murphy was always chasing his tail, just trying to make enough to stay put, and he was likely a tenant at will.
What does at will mean in this context?
It means no lease, no security, none. The landlord or the middleman could evict him, his entire family, instantly, for any reason or no reason at all, fall behind on one rent payment, out. It created this constant background hum of fear.
And there was no point in trying to improve your situation, like building a better wall or draining a field?
Absolutely zero incentive. In fact, it was counterproductive. Any improvement you made, a stone wall, a better roof, anything legally became the landlord's property the moment you built it.
Seriously?
Yes. And worse, it often just meant they'd raise your rent next year because the land was now more valuable. So you were actively punished for trying to better your conditions.
Wow. Okay, so this system, this forces the dependence on that one crop, doesn't it?
Completely. To pay the ever-increasing rack rent, Roger had to use his best land, whatever little decent soil he had, to grow cash crops. Wheat, oats, barley, things that could be sold for export, primarily to England.
So the good land wasn't for feeding his family?
No. That food was shipped away. It left him only the smallest, worst patch of ground, maybe rocky, maybe boggy, to grow food for his own family. And on that kind of marginal land, only one crop could produce enough sheer bulk, enough calories, to keep a large family alive year-round.
The potato.
The potato, specifically the lumper variety.
Ah, the lumper. Not exactly a gourmet item, I gather.
No, apparently it was watery, kind of bland. But its advantage was yield. It could produce an incredible amount of food per acre, up to 12 tons sometimes, even on really poor soil. That was its miracle.
Enough calories to survive on.
Exactly. Potatoes and maybe some buttermilk for protein and vitamins. It was a surprisingly adequate diet, nutritionally speaking, which is why the population had actually boomed despite the poverty. People were generally quite healthy physically.
But there was a hidden danger, a massive one.
A fatal flaw. And it wasn't just the reliance on one crop, it was the reliance on one type of that crop, grown in a specific way.
The lumper.
Yes. And crucially, how it was propagated. Potatoes can be grown from seeds, which creates genetic diversity, but that's slow and less predictable. For yield and consistency, farmers use cuttings or seed potatoes, which are essentially clones.
Clones. So every lumper potato plant in Ireland was basically identical.
Genetically, yes, almost entirely.
Yeah.
You had millions of people relying for their very survival on a food source that was effectively one single organism, replicated across the entire island. A monoculture of incredible vulnerability.
A house of cards built on potatoes?
Precisely. If a disease appeared that could kill one lumper plant, it could kill them all. The entire food supply rested on this single, fragile pillar.
And in 1845, something arrived that was perfectly designed to knock that pillar down.
Yeah, the whole situation shifts dramatically in the late summer, early autumn of 1845. The weather plays a huge part. It had been unusually cool, damp, wet all summer. Perfect conditions, though nobody knew it, for what was coming.
And then something strange happened. I read about a fog.
That's right. People reported this weird, dense fog rolling in off the sea. Bluish tinge, some said. Hung around for days. Unnatural feeling.
Eerie.
Very. And when it finally lifted, this smell, this awful, sickly, sweet smell of decay was just everywhere.
And pervasive.
Yeah. And the plants, what did they see? Farmers like our fictional Roger Murphy, they'd walk out to their potato ridges, and the leaves, they were turning black, curling up, almost as if they'd been burnt.
But maybe the potatoes underground are okay. That must have been the hope.
The desperate hope, yes. But when they started digging, it was horrifying. Instead of firm potatoes, they were pulling up this black, slimy, rotting mush.
Oh, God.
They might look okay for a few hours, maybe, but then they just dissolve into this foul-smelling slime, completely inedible, gone.
And nobody knew why. What did they think was happening?
Theories were all over the place. Static electricity from the new railway lines, some thought. mortiferous vapors rising from the earth, maybe punishment from God. They had no concept of microbiology back then.
So they didn't know it was a fungus?
No idea it was Phytophthora infestans, an airborne microscopic fungus we now know likely traveled from North America, maybe in infected seed potatoes on a ship. All they knew was that their lifeline, their only food, was literally melting away in their hands.
How bad was it that first year, 1845?
It was bad, definitely, but patchy. The blight didn't hit everywhere equally. Maybe about half the crop was lost nationally. Some areas, particularly in the west and north, got hit harder than others.
So families like the Murphys, they could potentially survive that first hit.
They could, and many did, but only by making terrible sacrifices. Selling the pig early, obviously. Pawning any tools they had, blankets, even the few decent clothes they owned for Sunday Mass. Just desperately trying to buy enough imported grain, like Indian meal, to bridge the gap until the next harvest. They were deeper in debt, hanging on by a thread, but alive.
Okay. But then came 1846, and this is where it gets almost cruel.
Deeply cruel.
Really?
Psychologically devastating. Because the summer of 1846 was beautiful. Warm, sunny, perfect growing weather. And the potato plants looked fantastic. Lush, green, healthy. Everyone thought the problem, whatever it was, had passed.
A collective sigh of relief.
Huge relief. A desperate belief that, okay, that was a one-off horror. Now things are back to normal. God is merciful.
So they invested everything in that year's crop.
Everything.
Yeah.
Any tiny resource they had left, anything they could borrow. It all went into planting for 1846. This was the harvest that would save them, pay off the debts from 45, get it back on their feet. They bet the farm, literally.
But the weather, the good weather, was a deception.
It was a biological trap.
Yeah.
Those beautiful, mild, moist conditions were actually perfect for the Phytophthora fungus spores that had survived the winter lurking in the soil or in infected tubers used as seed.
Oh, no.
It just needed that combination of warmth and moisture to explode.
It did.
In a single week, late July, early August, 1846, the blight came back. But this time, it wasn't patchy. It was total, absolute. It swept across the country like fire, moving 50 miles a week, some reports said, wiped out virtually the entire crop, nationwide.
After everyone had banked everything on it.
Exactly. That false hope was the killer blow.
Yeah.
It left the population utterly exposed. No food reserves, no pig to sell, nothing left to pawn. Just fields of stinking black slime and winter coming.
Unimaginable despair.
Total. And just as this absolute dread is descending, the calendar is turning towards a very significant date in the traditional Irish year.
Samhain.
Samhain.
Yeah.
Pronounced Samhain, October 31st. Traditionally, the end of the harvest season, the end of summer, the beginning of the darker half of the year. For the ancient Celts, this was huge. It was their new year, effectively.
Yeah, and it had spiritual significance too, right?
Yeah.
More than just a harvest festival.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it was a transition point, light to dark, warmth to cold, plenty to scarcity. It was believed to be a time when the boundaries between worlds were porous.
The veil is thin.
That's the phrase. The veil between the world of the living and the other world, the realm of spirits, fairies, the dead, was believed to be at its absolute thinnest on Samhain night.
Allowing spirits to cross over.
Yes. Spirits of ancestors, perhaps, but also potentially mischievous or even malevolent entities. They could walk the earth freely on that one night.
So people needed protection.
Definitely. Traditions grew up around defense. Wearing costumes, for instance, disguises made from animal skins or with faces blackened with soot. The idea being to blend in with the spirits, confuse them so they wouldn't recognize you and carry you off.
And bonfires.
Huge bonfires on hilltops. Partly celebration, marking the year's end, but also purification and protection. Driving away the darkness, warding off bad influences.
And this is where we get the jack-o'-lantern, or its ancestor.
Exactly. The tradition was to take a root vegetable, usually a large turnip in Ireland and Scotland, sometimes a beet or potato, hollow it out, carve a grotesque face into it.
Why grotesque?
To frighten other spirits away. Then you'd place a glowing ember from the bonfire, or later a candle, inside it.
Creating a lantern.
A spooky lantern. And these were called jack-o'-lanterns, named after an old folktale figure, Stingy Jack, a trickster doomed to wander the earth forever with only a coal and a carved turnip to light his way.
And people put these outside their homes.
By doorways, windowsills. Specifically to act as wards, to scare off any malevolent spirits roaming on Samhain night.
So as 1846 ends, you have this ancient tradition focused on spirits and the dead.
Colliding with the horrifying reality of mass starvation just beginning. The blight had created the conditions for famine, and now the system was about to ensure it became a catastrophe, creating hundreds of thousands of very real ghosts.
Right, so the harvest failure of 46 was total. This brings us into 1847, a year that just looms large in Irish history. Black 47.
Black of 47, it's when the starvation truly takes hold on a mass scale, and when you see the natural disaster of the blight become, well, something else, something man-made, enforced by policy.
And the most shocking aspect of this, the thing that's almost impossible to comprehend, is about the food, isn't it?
It is. It's the great terrible paradox of the famine. While hundreds of thousands of Irish people were dying of hunger and related diseases, Ireland was exporting enormous quantities of food.
Exporting food while people starved.
Yes, enough food potentially to have prevented the worst of the starvation.
What kind of food are we talking about, and how much?
We have the shipping records. In 1847, the single deadliest year, when maybe 400,000 people died, nearly 4,000 ships sailed from Irish ports like Dublin, Cork, Limerick, bound for England.
And their cargo holds were full of
Grain wheat, oats, barley, livestock cattle by the hundreds of thousands, pigs, sheep, dairy products, butter, vast amounts of it, eggs, perfectly good nutritious food. Just to give you a figure, in the first 9 months of Black 47 alone, while people were literally eating grass and nettles to survive, Ireland exported almost 200,000 cattle, nearly 500,000 pigs, and over 800,000 gallons of butter.
It beggars belief. How? How is this allowed? How is it justified?
It comes back to that system we talked about, the rack renting, the cash economy imposed on a subsistence people, that grain, those animals. They weren't seen by the landlords or the government as food for the Irish people who grew them.
They were money.
They were a money crop, a commodity to be sold to pay the rent owed to the often absent landlords. And the British government, committed to laissez-faire economics, refused to interfere with the market, refused to close the ports, refused to halt exports.
So the market was more important than lives.
That was the prevailing ideology. There are harrowing eyewitness accounts. People describing carts piled high with sacks of grain, heading towards the ports for export, being guarded by armed British soldiers.
Guarded? Why?
To prevent starving locals from trying to seize the food. And these guarded carts would pass skeletal figures dying by the roadside. It wasn't just a shortage of potatoes, it became starvation by policy. Starvation enforced at gunpoint in some cases.
Who was making these decisions? There must have been individuals in charge.
The key figure, the man really orchestrating the British government's response or lack thereof, was Sir Charles Trevelyan. He was the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, basically the famine administrator.
And his philosophy was
guided by two core beliefs, both utterly disastrous in this context. First, that rigid, almost religious belief in laissez-faire we mentioned. He genuinely believed that any government intervention in the food market, even providing cheap food, would be catastrophic in the long run.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He argued it would create dependency, distort trade, discourage private enterprise.
Yeah.
He actually shut down some early small-scale government attempts to provide cheap imported corn, believing it undermined the natural market. His stated goal was Irish property should support Irish poverty.
Meaning the landlords should pay for relief.
Yes, shifting the burden entirely onto the Irish landowners, which, as we'll see, had its own terrible consequences, mainly encouraging more evictions.
But you said two beliefs. What was the other one?
This one's arguably even more chilling. Trevelyan was a devout evangelical Protestant, and he held a strong belief in providentialism, meaning he saw the famine not primarily as a human tragedy or a result of blight and bad policy, but as an act of God, a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, as he put it in his writings.
God's judgment.
Yes, he genuinely seemed to believe the famine was divine punishment sent to cure what he saw as the deep flaws in the Irish character, perceived laziness, reliance on the potato, lack of thrift, moral failings.
Yeah.
He saw the Irish as inherently flawed and needing correction.
So the famine was corrective, a lesson from God.
He literally called it the sharp but effectual remedy needed to reshape Irish society. He thought it was God's way of forcing Ireland to modernize, to become more like England. It's an ideology that allowed for, even justified, mass death as a necessary evil for moral improvement.
That's horrifying. So with that mindset, what did relief actually look like under Trevelyan?
It was designed not to be appealing. The main form of relief was the workhouse system. But these were built on the principle of less eligibility.
Less eligibility.
The conditions inside the workhouse had to be deliberately worse, more degrading, more miserable than the life of the poorest independent laborer outside. The idea was to deter anyone from seeking help unless they were absolutely, completely desperate. At death's door.
How did they make it worse? What were the conditions?
Firstly, to even get in, a family usually had to surrender any land they held, even if it was just a tiny quarter-acre plot. Give up everything. become official paupers.
And what's inside?
The family unit was systematically destroyed. Husbands were separated from wives, children were separated from parents, they were housed in different wings, often forbidden from even speaking to each other.
Why? What was the purpose of that cruelty?
Discipline. Breaking old habits, instilling order, destroying the traditional Irish family structure, which was seen as part of the problem.
What did they do all day?
Pointless, back-breaking labor, often. Breaking stones for roads was common, even for the weak and elderly, or grinding corn by hand, all while subsisting on maybe one meal a day of thin, watery porridge, often called stirabout, served in silence. Strict silence was enforced.
It sounds like a prison, but worse.
They quickly became death traps, massively overcrowded, zero sanitation, diseases like typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, cholera just ripped through them. A huge percentage of people who entered a workhouse never came out alive. Maybe over a quarter died inside. They were designed for moral reform, but they functioned as places of mass death.
Was there any other option if you couldn't face the workhouse?
There was one other deeply controversial form of relief offered by some Protestant missionary groups. It became known as souperism.
Souperism.
Yes, these groups would offer soup, maybe small amounts of food or clothing, but often there was a catch.
Which was?
You had to renounce your Catholic faith and convert to Protestantism to receive the aid.
Seriously, they used starvation as a tool for conversion.
In some notorious cases, yes. For the starving Irish, who were overwhelmingly devout Catholics, this presented an agonizing choice. Physical survival versus what they saw as spiritual damnation.
Betraying their faith to feed their children.
Exactly. Those who took the soup were often ostracized by their own communities. It became a term of deep shame and bitterness that lingered for generations. It just highlights how even acts that looked like charity could be weaponized in that environment. So as the famine ground on past Black 47, the situation for those still clinging to their land got even worse, driven by policy changes in London.
How so? What changed?
Parliament amended the poor laws, making Irish landlords financially liable for the poor rates. Essentially, the taxes needed to support the destitute tenants on their land, including those in the dreaded workhouses.
Ah, so Trevelyan's Irish property supports Irish poverty idea was now law.
Exactly. But think about the incentive that created for a landlord already struggling or just ruthless. The quickest way to drastically reduce your tax bill.
Get rid of the tenants.
Get rid of the poor tenants. All of them. This unleashed a brutal new wave of mass evictions, known as the clearances.
How do they do it?
Landlords hired gangs, sometimes called crowbar brigades, tough, intimidating men. They'd descend on a village, often deliberately at dawn or dusk, pull the families out of their cabins, physically drag them out.
Men, women, children.
Everyone. Out into the cold, regardless of weather. And then the crowbars would come out, and they would systematically demolish the cabins, knock down the walls, pull off the thatch roof.
Why demolish them? Why not just evict?
To make sure the families couldn't creep back in for shelter, to render them utterly homeless, to erase their presence from the land. It was scorched earth policy on a family level.
Leaving them completely destitute on the roadside.
With literally nowhere to go. For hundreds of thousands facing that or already in that position, there seems only one possible escape, however desperate.
Emigration. Getting out of Ireland altogether.
Yes. Long, agonizing journeys on foot to the nearest port. Cork, Dublin, Liverpool maybe, if they could scrape together passage money. Seeking a place on a ship bound for North America.
And these ships, they earned a grim nickname, didn't they?
They did. They became known as the coffin ships.
Coffin ships tells you everything.
And the name was horrifically accurate. These weren't passenger liners. They were often old cargo ships, timber ships, barely seaworthy, certainly not designed or equipped for carrying hundreds of desperate, sick, starving human beings.
What were conditions like on board?
Appalling. Hundreds crammed into the dark, airless steerage decks, often not enough headroom to even stand up straight. Sanitation, virtually non-existent, maybe a few buckets for hundreds of people for a voyage lasting 6 weeks or more. Food and water provided were minimal, often contaminated.
Ideal conditions for disease.
Guaranteed conditions.
Yeah.
Typhus, which became known as ship fever, dysentery, cholera, they spread like wildfire in those holds. It wasn't uncommon for a third of the passengers on a single voyage to die before reaching America or Canada.
A third. My God.
We have diaries from survivors. One man, Robert White, sailing in 47, wrote about the constant moaning, the stench, the dead being brought up each morning.
Every morning.
Wrapped in rags, maybe weighted with a stone if one could be found, and just slipped overboard. Unceremoniously. He quotes another passenger lamenting that it would have been better to die at home with a green sod over us instead of dying like rotten sheep, flung into the sea. That level of dehumanization.
How many died just making the crossing?
Estimates are difficult, but for 1847 alone, it could be upwards of 17,000 people died just on the Atlantic Passage. Their graves are the ocean floor.
So the ones who did make it, landing in Boston, New York, gross ale in Canada, what state were they in?
Traumatized,
Yeah.
physically weakened, often still sick with ship fever, penniless, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and their memories, their culture, their traditions. And this is the crucial link. This is where the ghosts of the famine meet the ancient traditions of Samhain, and something new begins to form.
How did Samhain change with that trauma?
Think about it. The old festival was about the veil thinning, about spirits walking. For these survivors, that wasn't abstract folklore anymore. The ghosts were real. They were the faces of parents, siblings, children left behind in unmarked famine graves, or lost beneath the waves on the coffin ship. The other world felt terrifyingly close.
So the festival carried a much heavier weight now.
Immense weight. And as these Irish immigrants carved out communities in America, they brought their traditions with them. But traditions adapt to new environments.
Like the jack-o'-lantern. You mentioned turnips earlier.
Right. In Ireland, the traditional Samhain lantern was carved from a tough, awkward turnip. But turnips weren't as common or easy to grow in parts of America. What was plentiful, especially around harvest time,
Pumpkins.
big, bright orange Native American pumpkins. And crucially, much softer and easier to carve than a dense turnip.
So practicality took over.
It seems so. The Irish immigrants adopted the pumpkin as the new medium for their traditional spirit-warding lantern. The jack-o'-lantern was reborn, bigger and brighter, in an American vegetable. The function stayed the same, but the form adapted.
Okay, that explains the pumpkin. What about trick-or-treating? Where does that come from?
That has roots in the old Samhain custom of guising or mumming.
Guising.
Yeah, back in Ireland and Britain, groups, often young men, would go door to door in costumes on festive nights like Samhain. They'd recite verses, maybe sing a song, perform a little skit, maybe pull a harmless prank.
In exchange for?
Food or drink for the communal feast, or maybe a few coins. It was a form of community celebration and redistribution.
So how does that connect to the famine and trick-or-treating?
Well, for the famine survivors arriving in America, the memory of going door to door asking for sustenance wasn't just a playful tradition anymore. It was tied to the raw, recent memory of desperate begging, of literally pleading for food to survive during the hunger.
Ah, so the act itself, asking for food from strangers, had a new, darker resonance.
Exactly. That playful exchange was now haunted by the ghost of real starvation. But over time, as the immigrants assimilated, as their children grew up in a context of relative American abundance, that raw edge softened.
It became less about survival, more about fun.
Right. The desperation faded, replaced by a more formalized, ritualized asking. The memory of begging was perhaps contained, made safe, transformed into the playful demand for a treat with the mock threat of a trick. The cultural scar tissue healed over, leaving the ritual but obscuring the original wound.
So modern Halloween, the ghosts, the pumpkins, the trick-or-treating, it's all deeply rooted in that famine experience.
I think the argument is compelling, yes. It's not that every element comes only from the famine, other influences blended in too, of course, but the specific shape of American Halloween, the version that's now gone global, it seems undeniably forged in the trauma and the cultural memory of the Great Hunger.
The skeletons aren't just generic, spooky figures.
They're the sanitized echo of the famished and ghastly skeletons that eyewitnesses describe seeing in Irish cabins and on the coffin ships.
And asking for candy is
The ghost of a desperate plea for food. The holiday, in a way, became a container for that trauma, a way for a people to process and eventually mask an unspeakable horror by turning their real ghosts into costumes children could wear once a year.
It's hard to really absorb the scale of it. Ungor to more. The Great Hunger, what are the final numbers, roughly?
The figures are still debated. Record-keeping was poor. But the consensus is at least 1 million people died from starvation and disease between about 1845 and 1852.
1 million.
And perhaps as many as 2 million more emigrated, fled the country, mostly during that same period and in the immediate aftermath.
So out of a population of maybe 8.5 million?
You're looking at a loss of almost a third of the population in just a few years, dead or gone. It fundamentally altered the island. You can still see the traces today, the abandoned fields, the ruined cottages overgrown with grass, a silence in the landscape.
So the next time The next time you carve a pumpkin or see kids going door to door.
Yeah, maybe take a second. Look past the plastic masks and the sugar rush. See it not just as, harmless fun, but as this cultural echo. An unintended memorial, perhaps, carried across the ocean by survivors of an almost unimaginable nightmare.
It definitely gives you a completely different perspective on a holiday we thought we knew.
It does. It makes you think about how history, even painful history, gets embedded in culture in ways we don't always recognize.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe. We dress up as ghosts and ghouls once a year, transforming that famine trauma into something manageable, even fun. But what other ghosts are we carrying? What other difficult histories might be hidden, unacknowledged inside our own familiar celebrations or traditions today?
That's a powerful question to leave people with. What parts of our past are still haunting our present, just beneath the surface?
And so, another chapter closes. For more journeys into history's forgotten files, please like and subscribe. Your next story awaits.